Hello. When we talk about drug policy, we have to face the fact that there is a crisis. There is a crisis with the amount of people dying in the United Kingdom, the United States and various places around the world. But there is also a crisis involving the power of organised crime and the corruption that that causes. I'll explain more in a moment. I should introduce myself. I'm Neil Woods and I'm part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, which is an international UN accredited organisation made up of law enforcement figures, police, prosecutors and the like. And we campaign for an evidence-based drug policy and evidence-based policing. The corruption of the drug war is hidden from the public generally because it is considered that if the public knew too much about it, then they would perhaps lose confidence in the police or the system. That's not an unreasonable fear, but it's clearly come to the point where the public really need to know about the extent of drug war corruption. As an undercover police officer, I was infiltrating an organised crime group headed by someone called Colin Gunn. At the time, Gunn had a spy in the police, and I came very close to this person. He was on my backup team for a short time. Now, he was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. When this was eventually found out, the universal attitude was, well, of course this happens. We know this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? So I should make something very clear. The only form of criminality that can pay for that level of corruption is from the illicit drug supply. Not only is it a greater amount of money than any other form of criminality, it's also affected by the way that we police drugs. Police are really, really good at catching drug dealers. They can catch them week after week for as long as you like if you give them the direction to do so and the resources. The trouble is, the police never reduce the size of the market. So in arresting one dealer, you just create an opportunity for another one. So police never reduce the size of the market, they only change the shape of it. And over time, what that means is an increase in violence. You see, the most successful gangster is the one who can most successfully intimidate the community in which they operate. So over time, although police, as I say, will catch drug dealers, they'll do it very well, more often than not, they will catch the low-hanging fruit. They will catch the less successful ones. So over time, this creates a Darwinian situation where the most violent and intimidating rise to the top. What this also means is that the market becomes monopolised. So the wealth is concentrated into fewer and fewer hands. This makes the corruption of the system much more possible. And I've seen that corruption close up. I published my experiences in Good Cop, Bad War. And as a result of that, I had many letters, emails and other correspondence from police, from people from both sides of the fence. But there's one particular letter that stopped me in my tracks. And it was from a young man called Adam, who'd grown up with problematic heroin users as parents. And he's described some horrific times as a child. One in particular where he witnessed his mother being forced to drink petrol because of a £20 drug debt. This and many other stories made me ask this question, which I'd asked so many times. How have we come to this? How have we come to a situation where police corruption is accepted as a side effect of drug policy? How have we come to a situation where it's a normal event for a child to witness such horrific treatment of their parents because of a problematic drug use? Children should not be witnessing their parents being forced to drink petrol. So I got together with my co-writer J.S. Raffaeli to research a history of how we've got to where we are now in Britain. We called it drug wars. And one of the most important things that we found was that it wasn't always like this. In the UK, we had a very different way of doing things. It was called the British system. And this was the last resistance internationally to the American way of doing things, the moralising prohibition that they insisted everyone follow. There were times when the Americans were trying to persuade British politicians to follow their way, when the Americans measured their problematic heroin users in the hundreds of thousands. In Britain, we measured them in hundreds. Before American-style prohibition was brought into the United Kingdom, there was no criminality associated with drugs at all. It wasn't even considered connected. Drugs were just seen as a medical issue. There was no need to steal to pay for a problematic heroin supply, because someone with a problem with that particular drug would go to the doctor and the doctor would prescribe it to them. The numbers stayed very low because there was never any incentive to sell drugs to pay for any more. We didn't have organised crime supplying it because there was no market for them. As a result of moving to an American system of prohibition, we now have the situation that we have. We have rampant corruption. We have increasing violence in our streets. Not all of the recent violence in the United Kingdom can be directly attributed to the drug supply, but a significant amount of it can. But bear in mind that with gangsters competing to become more and more violent, that violence becomes endemic and it also becomes normal. It becomes normalised. And this has an influence in broad terms in youth culture. If we want to reduce violence in our streets, we have to change our drug policy. In the news very much over the last year or two has been the issue of county lines. And for those of you who don't know what that is, this is the use of children to supply. There is a clear cause and effect for the situation that we're now in. In the news often recently has been the issue of county lines, and this is because of the monopolisation of the drug supply. Organised crime groups from the big cities are moving to take over the supply in county towns and seaside towns. It's in the news very much because these organised crime groups are using children to transport and sell these drugs. They are exploiting children. Again, we have to ask ourselves, how have we come to this situation where children are at the front line in a violent drug trade? Well, it's down to drug policy. It's down to how we have been policing drugs. County lines, the use of children, you could say actually that's my fault, or people like me, because I used to infiltrate and catch those drug dealing gangs. So the perfect response to the kind of tactics that I used to use as an undercover police officer is to exploit children. Children can't be infiltrated in the same way by police informants. They can't be infiltrated in the same way by police undercover operatives like myself. And of course, children can be seen as disposable. They're beneath the radar. Now, if we hadn't had aggressive police tactics to investigate drug supply, this exploitation of children would never have happened. It's a clear cause and effect. It's very clear how we have come from the early 1960s with no criminality associated with drug supply at all to the situation we have now where the value of the black market of drugs is £10 billion a year or more in the United Kingdom. This has caused widespread corruption, an increase in violence, an increase in drug deaths, and the exploitation of children. How bad do things have to be before we change direction? Thank you for listening.